Joining us now from Johannesburg is Ayabonga Cawe. He's a development economist and the co-founder of Rethink Africa. With us here in our Washington, D.C. studio is Ebrahim Rasool. He served as the South African ambassador to the United States and is currently a distinguished scholar in residence at Georgetown University. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me start with you. Students who marched in South Africa say that they are being priced out of a good education. Do they have a point?
Well, as a father who has a daughter at the University of Pretoria studying second-year medicine, I must say that relative to the United States, South Africa is affordable. But I think in absolute terms, in African terms and in South African terms, and given the state of our economy, and given the need for the best human resources our country can produce, I don't think that we have invested sufficiently in higher education, and therefore I think that there is a point, but it is a point made for the lower end students, largely black, largely poor.
Ayabonga, the South African authorities ultimately relented on those proposed fee increases, but it does raise the question, of course, of how are these fees going to be financed in the future? I mean, South Africa's finance minister has already said that growth in the country is going to have to be cut. It's going to be cut from 2% to 1.5%. So where's the money going to come from?
I think as many people in the student movement are aware, I think, you know, the 0% fee increment or the sort of the moratorium on fee increases was a welcome and timely gain for the student movement. But I think no one within that student movement sees that as a victory, because precisely of what you are asking, where is the money going to come from to actually fund the existing fees and the existing debt and the existing challenges? You will have seen that at the University of the Western Cape in Bellville in Cape Town, there were significant struggles over the past few days to push the university towards accepting a no-fee registration, which meant that in order for students to register at that university, students were fighting to not pay any fees in order to register. Now, that is a major challenge that students have. In addition to that, I think precisely what you are raising around how the government is going to fund this issue is a major bone of contention. There are many people within Parliament who have been making numerous suggestions, but I think what it does require is a mindset shift from a range of people in our society, including the students themselves, in order for us to be able to say that the money in future for 2016, 2017, 2017 and 2018 can not only be seen to come from the government. We need a wide range of stakeholders to come to the table, including those in the private sector, in order for them to fund what is essentially a public good in our society that they are one of the major consumers of. I think this is one of the things that the Minister of Higher Education and Training has been raising, and I think it's a valid point to be making.
Ambassador, the ANC, which runs South Africa, it's been ruling South Africa since 1994, it promised free education for all South Africans. But let's look at the reality of the situation right now. South Africa is a relatively wealthy country. It's considered by the World Bank to be an upper middle income country. But has the country got its priorities right? I mean, how much of a priority is higher education for the government?
I think it's a question that must be answered in two parts. The one is that when we describe South Africa as a wealthy country, I think we're describing the situation of inheritance. Who inherited the wealth, where is it located, and where is it still concentrated, and where does it circulate?
It's badly distributed, right?
It's badly distributed, but what is worse about the distribution is that the distribution is also largely color-coded, despite an appearance of whites who may be poor, and despite the appearance of blacks who may be rich. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is that having served in various parts of government in South Africa, policy is always a set of trade-offs. I think we may have done well to deal with a safety net for the very poor who are unskilled, who have been unemployed and unemployable, and we have prevented largely the bottom of the world falling out through pensions and grants and a variety of other interventions. What is coming to bite South Africa now is its scarcity of really good skills for competitiveness in the global economy, which should tell us that the emphasis should shift to higher education. It should shift to giving young people the skills because you can't have another generation who is unemployable.
Now, what about the quality of South African education? The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says South African school kids ranked second to last in math and science. That's based on the test scores of 15-year-olds from 76 countries. South Africa came 75th. This in a country that spends a pretty large part of its GDP on education.
I think that the second, if there is to be a second transition, it is a transition from a focus on quantity, getting everyone enrolled into schools, to the quality of what happens in those schools. And that takes infinitely, not more resources, but more will. It takes more training. It means that one has to look at the teaching core. For example, about what is happening, it requires resources for the math and science and technology and engineering and other skills that are required. It takes a particular discipline from the teaching body in order to A, be retrained, and secondly, time on task. And then I think we need qualitatively to improve what comes out of the school systems if our youth are going to be able to compete with their equivalents across the world. And so I think that there's a shift in the level of education that we need to focus on, but there's also the shift from quantity and quantitative goals to quality and qualitative goals that we need to invest in.
Ayabonga, and looking at the political responsibility for what is happening in South Africa right now, President Jacob Zuma says the protests are not a sign of discontent within the ANC, but has more to do with demands that black people gain equal access to an economy that is still dominated by whites. And that goes back to training and education as well. Does the president have a point there?
I think the president is correct, but I think there's a significant amount of nuance within that issue. I think the first instance is that we need to acknowledge that, you know, our history of Bantu education in South Africa and the denial of the significant majority to access or to opportunities to access certain skills is coming back to bite us now. But I think there are two issues, major issues for me, especially around the question of, one, the historically black institutions. So if you look, for instance, at some of the tertiary institutions that have historically been black, some of what have been called historically black, bush colleges in South Africa. If you look at the funding from the Department of Higher Education and Training that goes to those institutions relative to their historically white counterparts, you can already see that there's significant disparities there. And I think if we are really serious about ensuring that quality goes to where it's needed the most, to the institutions that serve township, peri-urban and rural youth, then we need to ensure that some of the funding formulas that determine how much universities get need to really take this into account. I think on the second front, there's also a challenge around whether or not our education is a horse that's fit for the race. I think in the first instance, you know, there's this binary in South Africa that, you know, you start from grade 1 and you go up to grade 12 and you matriculate and then you go to university, and then that is the track that will then take you into employment. And what we are beginning to see now is that there's a lot of saturation in sort of the traditional economic sectors that have been the dominant employers in our history, and there's a resurgence again of a need for the artisanal skills that are required to sort of undergirdle our infrastructure spend. And I think what we're seeing now is, as a result of deliberate policy decisions that have been made by our government, post-1994 even, we're seeing a significant need and a significant aging of the artisanal skills and the artisanal profile that we have in our economy. And there's a significant need to change the mindsets, but also change the resource allocation that goes to further education and training and vocational education and training colleges in South Africa.
Ambassador, I mean, if we look at this 21 years after the end of apartheid, you know, as the OECD tells us, that report that I cited tells us, education is going to be a very powerful predictor of the future wealth that South Africa is going to be able to generate. The current picture right now does not augur well, does it?
I think that South Africa, like much of the world, is going through a profound transition. I think if it makes Africa its benchmark, then it will perfect the art of extractive wealth, it will perfect the art of agriculture and all of those kind of things, and we must maintain our base there. But I think South Africa has so much more to offer off an existing industrial base. I think we can turn extractive wealth into, for example, jewelry. We can, for example, turn agricultural wealth into, for example, massive export markets of more manufactured goods and niche markets that are required. And I do think that we have the capacity, given the rate at which ICTs and connectivity is growing in South Africa, for us to, for example, create the next generation of Africans using, for example, the Square Kilometre Array telescope to get people focused on the heavens and a new breed of scientists coming out, to be able to use the fiber optic connectivity to turn the knowledge economy into something great. But I think, South Africans need to conceive of themselves as great.
Ayabonga, how do you see the short-term outlook for South Africa unfold? I mean, of course, the one other big problem that the country has is its high rate of unemployment, around 25%, which is significantly higher than the average for most middle-income countries, which is 11%. And the South African government's been criticized by the IMF for not being sensitive to the needs of the unemployed in South Africa. So what's the short-term outlook?
Look, I mean, even that definition of the unemployment rate being at 25% is by the strict definition, which excludes discouraged job seekers. So all of the people who haven't looked for a job over the past 12 months or so are excluded from that figure. So, I mean, if you included them, you'd probably be sitting with a figure just about 40%. So you can already see that we're in a crisis situation. But I think one of the major challenges we have in South Africa is that we've really taken an approach which has normalized crisis as a status quo in South Africa. You know, the ambassador speaks about value addition. And I think if we think about the short-term outlook in South Africa now, you have a significant amount of people who are excluded from the mainstream economy, impatient about the pace of which change is happening in our economy, and also impatient at the lack of sort of urgency and the perceived lack of political will in addressing some of the major challenges that the country faces. I mean, let's make an example of the issue of beneficiation. You have had a commitment since, I think, the mid-2000s to value addition and beneficiation, in particular as it relates to the extractive sector in South Africa. But I think one thing we've never articulated is actually what are the stumbling blocks to us achieving a situation where we're able to add value to our minerals here and also be able to become a beneficiation hub for the continent as a whole. One of the major challenges we have is that business and government in South Africa are not singing off the same song sheet. And this is largely a historical issue, but also it's largely an issue now of perceptions and a lack of trust between the two players. And I think we need to be clear.
Right.
You know, if this government is saying that it is a developmental state, then we need to really see the strategic intent and the political will to be able to take on some of the difficult discussions in engaging capital in South Africa around ensuring that industrial development happens, but also it becomes a labor-intensive industrial development that is not labor displacing.
Ayabonga Cawe in Johannesburg, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool with me here in the studio. Thanks to both of you for joining us.